I came home from my business trip to find my husband's ex-girlfriend, sprawled across my white Italian leather sofa, painting her nails with my expensive polish. She looked up at me with those emerald eyes that Ryan used to gush about, and smiled. "Oh hey, Nat. Ryan said you wouldn't mind if I crashed here for a few weeks." My lease fell through. 3 weeks later, I had her evicted, Ryan served with divorce papers, and myself owning the house she thought she'd be inheriting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humid Oregon heat hit me like a wall as I stepped out of the taxi at my Sycamore Lane home in Millbrook Heights. After 5 exhausting days in Chicago, finalizing the Brennan Hotel redesign project, all I wanted was a cool shower and my own bed. My interior design business had been thriving, but the constant travel was wearing thin. I'd been looking forward to a quiet weekend with Ryan, maybe finally addressing the growing distance between us that had been developing over the past few months. The front door was unlocked, which immediately struck me as odd. Ryan was obsessive about security, especially since the recent break-ins that had plagued our neighborhood. I pushed through the heavy oak door, dragging my wheeled suitcase behind me, and called out his name. The house felt different somehow, charged with an unfamiliar energy that made my skin prickle. That's when I heard the laughter drifting from the living room. High, melodic, definitely feminine. My stomach clenched as I recognized that particular laugh from countless stories Ryan had shared during our early dating days. Stories about Vanessa Cole, the woman who had supposedly broken his heart 3 years before we met. The woman he claimed to have gotten over completely. I rounded the corner into our meticulously designed living space, the one featured in Portland Home and Garden magazine just last spring, and froze. There she was. Exactly as Ryan had described her, though he'd failed to mention how she seemed to command any room she occupied. Vanessa Cole lounged across my imported Italian leather sofa as if she owned it, one leg draped elegantly over the armrest. Her platinum blonde hair cascaded in perfect waves over her bare shoulders. And she wore what appeared to be one of my silk robes, the burgundy one Ryan had given me for our anniversary. She was painting her nails a deep crimson shade, using the vintage cut crystal dish I'd inherited from my grandmother as a makeshift manicure station. The dish that was supposed to hold only my grandmother's pearl earrings and nothing else. The casual violation of something so precious made my hands shake with instant rage. Vanessa glanced up at me with those striking emerald eyes that Ryan used to describe in nauseating detail during his vulnerable moments, and her lips curved into a smile that somehow managed to be both innocent and predatory. "Oh hey Nat," she said, her voice carrying a slight southern drawl that hadn't been mentioned in any of Ryan's stories. Ryan said, "You wouldn't mind if I crashed here for a few weeks. My lease fell through, and you know how impossible the rental market is right now." I stood there, suitcase handle still gripped in my white-knuckled fist, trying to process what I was seeing and hearing. She spoke as if we were old friends, as if her presence in my home was not only expected but welcome. The casual way she shortened my name to Nat when only my closest friends were permitted that familiarity made my jaw clench. "Where is Ryan?" I managed to ask, proud that my voice came out steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Oh, he ran to the store," Vanessa replied, waving her wet nails in the air to dry them. "We needed more wine for dinner. I'm making my famous shrimp scampi tonight. Ryan always said it was his favorite." She paused, studying my face with apparent amusement. "He should be back any minute. Why don't you go freshen up? You look exhausted." The dismissive tone, as if she were the hostess and I the unexpected guest, sent white-hot fury coursing through my veins. I had designed every inch of this house, had spent countless hours selecting each piece of furniture, each color on the walls. This was my sanctuary, my creative space, my home, and this woman was treating it like her personal resort. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom on autopilot, my mind reeling with questions and implications. In our walk-in closet, I discovered that Vanessa had made herself thoroughly at home. Her clothes hung beside mine, expensive designer pieces that suggested she wasn't exactly struggling financially despite her supposed housing crisis. A familiar cologne scent lingered on Ryan's side of the closet, but it was mixed with something else, something floral and distinctly feminine. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "Hey babe, picked up groceries. Vanessa's cooking tonight. Hope that's okay. We need to talk when you get home. We need to talk." 4 words that had never preceded good news in the history of relationships. I sank onto our bed, the same bed where Ryan and I had planned our future, discussed children, dreamed about growing old together. Now it felt contaminated by secrets and lies I was only beginning to uncover. I descended the stairs with careful, measured steps, my interior designer instincts automatically cataloging the changes Vanessa had made to my space. She'd rearranged the throw pillows on the sofa, moved my carefully curated coffee table books, and somehow managed to make my living room look like it belonged to someone else entirely. The violation went beyond mere physical space. It was an assault on my identity, my taste, my very sense of self. Vanessa had moved to the kitchen and was now chopping garlic with one of my best knives, humming a tune I didn't recognize. She'd changed into a flowing sundress that complemented her tan perfectly and seemed designed to showcase her figure from every angle. The kitchen island was covered with ingredients and wine bottles, 3 of them already empty, so I said, leaning against the doorframe with my arms crossed. "When exactly did this arrangement begin?" Vanessa looked up from her chopping, those green eyes wide with feigned innocence. "Oh, didn't Ryan tell you? I've been here since Tuesday. He said you were so busy with work that you wouldn't even notice." She laughed that musical laugh again. "Men, right? They never communicate properly." Tuesday. I had left for Chicago on Monday morning, which meant Vanessa had moved into my house within hours of my departure. The calculated timing made my stomach churn with betrayal and disbelief. "And your lease situation?" I pressed, fighting to keep my voice level. "Well," Vanessa said, her knife pausing mid-chop. "It's complicated. The landlord decided to sell unexpectedly, and finding a new place in this market." She shrugged helplessly, but her expression suggested she wasn't particularly troubled by her housing predicament. The front door opened, and Ryan's voice called out, "Honey, you home?" His tone carried a forced cheerfulness that immediately put me on alert. This was not the voice of a man excited to see his wife after a week apart. Ryan appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying 2 bags of groceries, his dark hair slightly disheveled and his usually confident demeanor replaced by something resembling nervous energy. He was an attractive man, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of smile that had initially swept me off my feet. But now, seeing him glance between Vanessa and me with obvious anxiety, that same smile looked calculating rather than charming. "Natalie," he said, setting the bags on the counter with deliberate care. "How was Chicago? Get everything sorted with the Brennan project?" His casual tone felt like a slap. After a week away, after coming home to find his ex-girlfriend installed in our house, he was asking about work as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. "The project went fine," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet, "though I'm more interested in discussing our houseguest situation." Ryan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell I'd learned to recognize over our 3 years of marriage. "Look, it's temporary. Vanessa needed help, and we have the space. I didn't think you'd mind." "You didn't think I'd mind," I repeated slowly, letting each word hang in the air between us. "You didn't think your wife would mind if you moved your ex-girlfriend into our home while I was away on business." Vanessa cleared her throat delicately. "Maybe I should give you 2 some privacy to discuss this," she said, though she made no move to leave the kitchen. Instead, she continued her meal preparation, clearly intending to eavesdrop on every word. "No," I said firmly. "If this concerns you, you should hear it." "How long exactly are you planning to stay, Vanessa?" She exchanged a quick glance with Ryan before answering. "Well, like I said, the rental market is just impossible right now, and honestly, it's been so nice reconnecting with Ryan. We have so much history together." Her smile turned slightly predatory. I'd forgotten how well we complement each other. The phrase "complement each other" delivered with such deliberate emphasis made my hands clench into fists. This woman wasn't just taking advantage of Ryan's misguided generosity. She was actively working to undermine my marriage. Ryan, I said, turning to face my husband directly, can I speak with you privately for a moment? He nodded reluctantly and followed me to his home office, the one room in the house I'd allowed him to decorate according to his own taste. The space was traditionally masculine, all dark wood and leather, and normally I found it comforting. Now it felt like enemy territory. What the hell is going on? I demanded as soon as he closed the door behind us. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his preparation for difficult conversations. Look, I know how this looks, but it's not what you think. Vanessa's going through a rough patch, and she needed help. I couldn't just turn her away. My voice rose despite my efforts to remain calm. Ryan, this is your ex-girlfriend, the woman you were supposedly heartbroken over for months before we met, and you moved her into our home without even discussing it with me. She's not just my ex-girlfriend, Ryan said, his defensive tone immediately setting off alarm bells in my head. She's someone I cared about deeply, someone who's important to me. The present tense usage didn't escape my notice. Important to you, how exactly? Ryan's silence stretched between us like a chasm. In that silence, I heard everything he wasn't saying, and the foundation of my world began to crumble. How long has this been going on? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Natalie, please, it's not like that. We're just friends. We've been talking, catching up. She reached out a few months ago when she moved back to Portland, and a few months ago, the timeline was becoming clearer, and with clarity came a crushing sense of betrayal. The same time you started working late, the same time you stopped touching me, the same time you began finding excuses to avoid spending time together. Ryan's face flushed, and I knew I'd hit the target. You're being paranoid. My work schedule has been crazy with the new development project. Don't lie to me, I said, stepping closer to him. Not anymore, just tell me the truth. Are you having an affair with Vanessa? The pause before his answer told me everything I needed to know, but when he finally spoke, the words still hit like physical blows. It's complicated, Natalie. What Vanessa and I have, it's not something I planned. It just happened. As if their affair was some natural disaster beyond human control rather than a series of deliberate choices that had destroyed my marriage. How long? I asked again, needing to know the full extent of my humiliation. Since April, he admitted, unable to meet my eyes. But nothing physical happened until recently. We were just talking at first, reminiscing about old times. April, 3 months of lies, 3 months of him coming home to me every night, while carrying on an emotional affair with another woman. 3 months of me noticing the distance between us and blaming myself for not being more understanding about his work stress. And now she's living in our house, I said, the full scope of his betrayal beginning to sink in. You moved your mistress into our home, into our guest room, while I was away working to support both our lifestyle and your real estate ventures. Don't call her that, Ryan snapped, his defensive anger flaring. This isn't some sordid affair. What Vanessa and I have is real. It's what we should have had 3 years ago if circumstances had been different. His words felt like ice water in my veins. If circumstances had been different. You mean if you hadn't met me? Ryan's silence was answer enough. I walked to the window of his office, looking out at the garden I'd spent countless hours designing and nurturing. The roses were in full bloom, the result of 3 years of careful attention and love. Just like my marriage, which I'd thought was flourishing but was apparently dying from root rot I'd been too blind to see. I want her out, I said quietly, still facing the window. Tonight, Natalie, be reasonable. She has nowhere else to go. I turned to face him, and something in my expression made him take a step backward. I don't care if she has to sleep in her car. I want your mistress out of my house tonight, or I'll remove her myself. You can't just throw her out. She's been here for days. She has tenant rights, I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. She's not paying rent, Ryan. She's a guest who has overstayed her welcome. My welcome? Look, just give me a few days to help her find something else. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder than it needs to be, I repeated, incredulous. You're having an affair, you moved her into our home, and you're asking me to be considerate of her housing needs. Before Ryan could respond, a gentle knock interrupted us. Sorry to interrupt, Vanessa's voice came through the door, but dinner's ready whenever you are. The casual domesticity of her announcement, as if she were the wife calling her family to dinner, made my vision blur with rage. She wasn't just sleeping with my husband, she was actively replacing me in my own home. "We'll be right there," Ryan called back, then turned to me with pleading eyes. "Can we just get through dinner? We can figure the rest out after." I stared at this man I'd married, this person I'd thought I knew completely, and realized I was looking at a stranger. The Ryan I'd fallen in love with would never have asked me to sit through dinner with his mistress in our home, but apparently, that Ryan had been an illusion. "Fine," I said, finally, "but after dinner we're having a very different conversation." As we returned to the kitchen, I noticed Vanessa had set the table for three, using my best china and crystal glasses. She'd even lit candles, turning my kitchen into an intimate dinner setting that felt like a mockery of every romantic meal Ryan and I had shared in this space. "I hope you're hungry," Vanessa said brightly, gesturing to the elaborate spread she'd prepare. "I made extra, because I wasn't sure when you'd be back." The shrimp scampi smelled incredible, and under different circumstances I might have appreciated the effort. But sitting at my own table eating food prepared by my husband's mistress, using dishes I'd carefully selected for special occasions, felt like participating in my own humiliation. Throughout the meal, Vanessa regaled us with stories of her modeling career, her travels, her various adventures since she and Ryan had broken up. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she belonged there, who saw no irony in the situation. Ryan laughed at her jokes, asked follow-up questions about her stories, and generally behaved like a man on a date rather than someone caught in adultery. I ate mechanically, my mind racing with questions and realization. This wasn't a temporary arrangement, or a simple case of Ryan helping an old friend. This was an audition. Vanessa was auditioning for the role of Ryan's wife, and he was clearly considering offering her the part. As I watched them interact, sharing inside jokes and comfortable silences, I understood that my marriage had been over for months. I'd just been too naive to recognize the signs. But I also realized something else. I wasn't going to go quietly into the night. I wasn't going to make this easy for them by simply packing my bags and disappearing. If Ryan thought he could replace me with his ex-girlfriend and keep everything we'd built together, he was about to learn otherwise. After dinner, as Vanessa began clearing the dishes with proprietary efficiency, I excused myself and stepped onto our back patio. The evening air was cooling, and the scent of jasmine from our neighbor's garden drifted over the fence. It was then that I noticed the elderly woman sitting on her own patio next door, watching me with intelligent, sympathetic eyes. Margaret Thornton had lived next to us since before we'd bought the house, but our interactions had been limited to polite waves and occasional small talk about gardening. She was in her 70s, impeccably dressed even in casual clothes, with silver hair always perfectly styled and an air of quiet authority that suggested she'd been important in some professional capacity before retirement. "Evening, dear," Margaret called softly, raising a glass of what appeared to be wine in a subtle toast. "Long day." Something in her tone suggested she'd observed more than just my arrival home. "You could say that," I replied, moving closer to the fence that separated our property. "I noticed you had a houseguest while you were away," Margaret continued, her voice carefully neutral. "Quite attractive young woman, very comfortable making herself at home." The delicate way she phrased her observation told me she'd been watching the situation unfold with the keen eye of someone experienced in reading human nature. "Yes," I said simply, unsure how much to reveal to my neighbor. Margaret set down her wine glass and moved closer to the fence, her expression growing more serious. "Dear, I hope you don't mind an old woman's observation, but in my experience, when a beautiful woman moves into a married couple's home while the wife is away, it's rarely about housing difficulties." Her directness caught me off guard, but also provided an unexpected comfort. Here was someone else who recognized the situation for what it truly was. "How long have you been watching?" I asked. "Long enough to see that your husband helped her move in on Tuesday morning," Margaret replied. "Long enough to notice that they've been spending quite a lot of time together on your patio in the evenings. Long enough to observe that she's been answering your front door when delivery drivers arrive, as if she lives there." Each observation felt like another piece of evidence in a case I was building against my own life, but Margaret's calm, matter-of-fact delivery also suggested she wasn't sharing this information out of idle gossip or malice. "Margaret," I said slowly, "what did you do before you retired?" Her smile was small but significant. "I was a family court judge for 32 years, dear. I've seen this particular story play out more times than I care to count." A family court judge, someone who understood the legal implications of adultery, property rights, and divorce proceedings. Someone who might have insights that could help me navigate the disaster my life had suddenly become. "Would you mind if I asked your advice about something?" I said, glancing back toward the house where Ryan and Vanessa's laughter drifted through the open kitchen window. "I thought you might," Margaret replied. "Why don't you come over for coffee tomorrow morning, say 9 o'clock, after your houseguests leave for whatever activities they have planned?" The way she said houseguests with just a hint of irony told me that Margaret understood exactly what kind of advice I might be seeking. "I'd like that very much," I said. As I returned to the house, I felt something I hadn't experienced since walking through my front door hours earlier. Hope. Not hope for saving my marriage, which was clearly beyond rescue, but hope that I wasn't as powerless in this situation as I'd initially believed. Inside, I found Ryan and Vanessa cleaning up the kitchen together with an ease that spoke of practiced routine. They moved around each other smoothly, Ryan washing dishes while Vanessa dried and put them away. She knew where everything belonged in my kitchen, which meant she'd been exploring my home far more thoroughly than any temporary guest. "I'm going to bed," I announced, causing them both to look up with expressions of surprise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "All ready?" Ryan asked. "I thought we could all watch a movie or something." The suggestion that I spend my evening watching movies with my husband and his mistress was so absurd that I almost laughed. "I'm tired from traveling. Don't stay up too late." As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I heard Vanessa say, "She seems nice. I can see why you fell for her." Ryan's response was too quiet for me to hear, but the intimate tone of their conversation made my skin crawl. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, taking inventory of the woman looking back at me. 31 years old, successful in my career, reasonably attractive, and apparently naive enough to miss a 3-month affair happening right under my nose. But as I studied my face, I also saw something else emerging: determination. Tomorrow I would begin fighting back. Tonight, I would plan. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of Ryan's voice and Vanessa's laughter drifting up from the living room below. They weren't trying to be quiet or discreet. If anything, they seemed to be celebrating their freedom to be together openly now that their secret was out. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the stairs, followed by the sound of the guest room door closing. So Ryan was at least maintaining the pretense of sleeping separately, though given the circumstances, even that felt like too little, too late. When Ryan finally came to bed an hour later, he tried to maintain normalcy by following his usual routine, brushing his teeth and changing into pajamas, as if this were any other night. But when he climbed into bed beside me, the space between us felt like an ocean. "Natalie," he whispered, "are you awake?" I didn't respond, though I'm sure he could tell from my breathing that I wasn't asleep. "We need to talk about this rationally," he continued. "I know you're hurt, and I understand why, but maybe this could be a good thing for both of us. Maybe it's time we admitted that we want different things." The audacity of his suggestion, that discovering his affair could somehow be beneficial for me, made me clench my teeth to keep from responding. He was already rewriting our story, making himself the victim of a marriage that simply wasn't working, rather than the perpetrator of a betrayal that had destroyed everything we'd built together. "I never meant for it to happen this way," he continued. "But sometimes life forces us to confront truths we've been avoiding. Maybe we both knew this wasn't working anymore." I wanted to scream that I had known no such thing, that I'd been perfectly happy in our marriage, until I discovered he'd been living a double life. But I remained silent, letting him reveal more of his twisted logic. "Vanessa and I have something special," he said, his voice growing more confident, as my silence continued. "Something we never really got to explore properly before. Maybe this is the universe giving us a second chance." The universe. as if cosmic forces had conspired to bring his ex-girlfriend back into his life, rather than acknowledging that he'd made deliberate choices to destroy our marriage. Eventually, Ryan's breathing evened out, and I knew he'd fallen asleep, but I remained awake, staring at the ceiling, and planning my next moves. By morning, I had the beginning of a strategy that would ensure Ryan's second chance with Vanessa came at a price he hadn't anticipated. I might have been caught off guard by their affair, but I wasn't going to be a victim. I was going to be a force to be reckoned with. The morning sun filtered through my bedroom curtains, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floor as I heard the unmistakable sounds of breakfast preparation drifting up from my kitchen. Vanessa's voice carried through the house, bright and cheerful as if she were hosting a morning show in my own home. The domestic scene below felt like a knife twisting in an already open wound. I checked my phone for the time and discovered 3 missed calls from my assistant Caroline, along with a text that read, "Emergency at the Morrison project. The client wants to change everything. Call me AS." Under normal circumstances, this would have sent me into immediate crisis management mode, but today my personal disasters took precedence over professional ones. Through my bedroom window, I could see Margaret Thornton's immaculate garden, where she was already tending to her prize-winning roses, despite the early hour. The woman moved with purpose and precision, qualities I desperately needed to cultivate in my current situation. Our coffee appointment couldn't come soon enough. I showered and dressed carefully, selecting a tailored navy dress that projected confidence and competence. If I was going to war, I needed to look the part. The woman staring back at me in the mirror bore little resemblance to the devastated wife, who had collapsed into bed the night before. This version of myself had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. Downstairs, the kitchen scene that greeted me was even more infuriating than I'd anticipated. Vanessa had transformed my morning routine into something that resembled a cozy bed and breakfast commercial. She'd prepared elaborate omelets, fresh fruit salad, and what appeared to be homemade croissants. My expensive coffee maker was brewing her preferred blend, and she'd arranged everything on my best-serving platters. Ryan sat at the kitchen island reading the newspaper, looking more relaxed and content than I'd seen him in months. He was wearing the casual weekend clothes I'd bought him for his birthday, and there was something different about his posture, his expression. He looked like a man who had finally gotten what he wanted. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Vanessa called out, her tone suggesting we were old friends rather than adversaries. "I made breakfast for everyone. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I went with classic French. Hope that's okay." The presumption embedded in her cheerful domesticity made my jaw clench. She was cooking in my kitchen, using my ingredients, serving my husband, and somehow making me feel like the outsider in my own home. How thoughtful, I managed, pouring myself coffee from the pot she'd commandeered. The brew was stronger than I preferred, another small violation of my morning routine. Ryan looked up from his newspaper with what I could only describe as cautious optimism. "Vanessa's an amazing cook. Remember those dinner parties she used to throw? Everything was always perfect." The casual reference to their shared past, delivered as if I should be delighted to hear about his ex-girlfriend's domestic skills, made my hand tighten around my coffee mug. He was already rewriting history, positioning Vanessa as the superior choice while simultaneously expecting me to appreciate her talents. "I'm sure she is," I replied, taking a deliberate sip of the too-strong coffee. "Unfortunately, I have a full day ahead of client emergencies wait for no one." Vanessa's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something calculating crossing her features before the bright smile returned. "Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping we could spend some time getting to know each other properly. Ryan's told me so much about your work. Interior design must be fascinating." The condescending tone she used when saying interior design suggested she viewed my career as little more than an expensive hobby. This from a woman who had been between careers for the better part of 2 years, according to Ryan's earlier explanations. "It keeps me busy," I said simply, refusing to be drawn into defending my professional accomplishments to my husband's mistress. "Well, maybe tomorrow then," Vanessa continued, undeterred by my obvious lack of enthusiasm. "I'm not working right now, so I have plenty of flexibility. It would be nice to have some female company around here." Female company. As if we were going to become friends, as if the woman sleeping with my husband was somehow a potential confidant. The delusion was breathtaking in its scope. Ryan's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with a frown. I need to head into the office for a few hours. The Peterson development is having permitting issues. He stood and kissed Vanessa on the cheek, a casual gesture of affection that he'd stopped offering me months ago. I'll be back this afternoon. The kiss was clearly meant to be seen, a declaration of where his loyalties now lay. But it also revealed something important. Ryan was comfortable enough with this situation to display his affection openly, which meant he'd already made his choice about our marriage's future. After Ryan left, the house fell into an uncomfortable silence. Vanessa continued cleaning up breakfast with proprietary efficiency, while I pretended to review emails on my phone. The kitchen felt smaller with just the two of us in it, the tension thick enough to cut with one of my German knives. "Natalie," Vanessa said finally, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I think we should clear the air about something." I looked up from my phone, curious to hear how she planned to justify the unjustifiable. "I want you to know that what's happening between Ryan and me isn't something we planned. It just developed naturally over time." She paused, studying my face for a reaction. "But I also think it's important to be honest about where things stand." The directness of her approach caught me off guard. I'd expected denial or deflection, not this confident declaration of intent. "And where exactly do things stand?" I asked, setting my phone aside to give her my full attention. Vanessa dried her hands on my dish towel and turned to face me completely. "Ryan and I have a connection that goes back years. We understand each other in ways that don't come along very often. I think you've probably sensed that he hasn't been happy for a while." The casual cruelty of her words, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty, took my breath away. She wasn't just admitting to the affair, she was explaining why I deserved it. "Is that what Ryan told you?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "That he hasn't been happy?" "He didn't have to tell me," Vanessa replied with a slight shrug. "It's obvious to anyone who knows him well. Ryan's always been happiest when he's with someone who challenges him, who matches his energy and ambition, someone who understands his world." The implication being that I didn't, that my role as his wife had somehow failed to meet these mysterious standards she'd apparently set. "And you believe you're that someone?" I asked. "I know I am," Vanessa said with unshakable confidence. "Ryan and I bring out the best in each other. We always have. If circumstances had been different 3 years ago, we never would have broken up in the first place." The rewriting of history was stunning in its audacity. According to Ryan's own stories, Vanessa had left him for a modeling opportunity in Los Angeles, breaking his heart in the process. Now she was casting their breakup as some sort of cosmic mistake that fate was finally correcting. "And what role exactly do you see me playing in this grand reunion?" I asked, morbidly curious about how far her delusions extended. Vanessa's smile turned almost pitying. "Look, I'm not trying to be cruel here. You seem like a nice person, and I'm sure you and Ryan had some good times together. But sometimes people grow in different directions. Sometimes what we think we want isn't actually what's best for us." The philosophical tone she'd adopted, as if she were delivering relationship wisdom rather than destroying my marriage, made my vision blur with rage. She was positioning herself as some sort of enlightened guide, helping Ryan discover his true happiness. "How generous of you to be concerned about what's best for Ryan," I said, standing up from my stool at the kitchen island. "Tell me, what's best for me in this scenario?" For the first time, Vanessa looked slightly uncomfortable. "I think that's something you'll have to figure out for yourself, but I hope you'll consider that holding on to something that isn't working anymore might not be the kindest thing for anyone involved." The audacity was breathtaking. She was actually suggesting that I was being selfish by not gracefully stepping aside to make room for her relationship with my husband. "How very thoughtful of you to worry about my kindness," I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'll certainly take your relationship advice under consideration." I left the kitchen before I said something that would reveal the full extent of my fury. Vanessa called after me with false sweetness. "I really do hope we can be friends, Natalie. This doesn't have to be ugly, friend." The woman was clearly living in an alternate reality, where adultery was just a minor social awkwardness that could be smoothed over with good intentions and positive thinking. At exactly 9 o'clock I knocked on Margaret Thornton's front door. She answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting, and invited me into a living room that spoke of refined taste and substantial means. The furniture was antique but well maintained, the art on the walls museum quality, and everything was arranged with the precision of someone who valued order and beauty. "Coffee or tea, dear?" Margaret asked, gesturing for me to sit on an elegant velvet sofa. "Coffee, please," I replied, noting that she'd already prepared a full service on a silver tray. Margaret poured with practiced grace and settled into the chair across from me, her posture erect and her attention focused entirely on my face. Despite her petite stature and grandmother's appearance, there was something formidable about her presence that reminded me she'd spent 3 decades making difficult decisions about people's lives. "Now then," she said, folding her hands in her lap, "tell me everything." The invitation to unburden myself to this near stranger felt surprisingly natural. Perhaps it was her professional demeanor, or maybe it was simply the relief of talking to someone who clearly understood the gravity of my situation. Whatever the reason, I found myself sharing details I hadn't even fully processed myself. I told her about the months of emotional distance from Ryan, the unexplained schedule changes, the gradual erosion of intimacy in our marriage. I described coming home to find Vanessa installed in our guest room, the casual way she'd made herself at home, and the devastating conversation with Ryan where he'd admitted to the affair. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see her sharp mind processing every detail, filing away information for future analysis. "And this morning?" she prompted when I paused. I recounted Vanessa's kitchen ambush, her confident assertions about Ryan's happiness and their destined reunion, her suggestion that I should gracefully step aside for the greater good. When I finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and studying my face with the intensity of someone reading evidence in a court case. 32 years on the family court bench," she said finally, "and I've seen this exact scenario more times than I can count. The pattern is always the same: emotional affair, physical escalation, bold introduction of the mistress into the family home, and then pressure on the wife to accept the new arrangement or leave quietly." Hearing my situation described as a pattern rather than a unique tragedy was oddly comforting. It meant there were established playbooks for dealing with men like Ryan and women like Vanessa. "What usually happens?" I asked. Margaret's smile was grim. "That depends entirely on how the wife chooses to respond. Some women do exactly what your houseguest is hoping you'll do. They accept that their marriage is over, negotiate a quiet divorce, and disappear with whatever settlement their guilt-ridden husband offers. And the others fight," Margaret said, her eyes sharpening with something that looked like anticipation. "They recognize that they're not dealing with a simple marital disagreement, but with a calculated campaign to steal their life, and they respond accordingly." The word steal resonated with me in a way that affair never had. Vanessa wasn't just sleeping with my husband, she was systematically taking over my existence, my home, my role, my future. "Margaret," I said slowly, "I want to fight, but I don't know how. I've never dealt with anything like this before." Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Dear, I've spent 3 decades helping women in exactly your position. I know every legal strategy, every financial protection, every psychological tactic that can be employed in these situations. The question is, how far are you willing to go?" The intensity of her gaze made it clear this wasn't a casual question. She was asking whether I was prepared for warfare, not just a polite divorce proceeding. "As far as necessary," I said without hesitation. Margaret's smile was sharp and approving. "Good, because half measures won't work against someone like Vanessa. She's already demonstrated that she's willing to move into your home and openly court your husband. This isn't a woman who responds to gentle persuasion." She stood and moved to an antique secretary desk, returning with a leather portfolio filled with documents. "First things first," Margaret said, opening the portfolio. "We need to document everything, every conversation, every financial transaction, every instance of their inappropriate behavior in your home. In Oregon, adultery may not affect property division, but it can absolutely influence spousal support and other considerations." She handed me a small digital recorder. "Keep this with you at all times, record every interaction with both of them. Oregon is a one-party consent state, which means you don't need their permission to record conversations you're part of. The practical nature of her advice grounded me in a way that emotional support never could. This wasn't about healing or processing feelings. This was about winning. Second, Margaret continued, we need to understand your financial position completely, joint accounts, individual assets, property ownership, business interests. Knowledge is power, and right now, they think they have all the advantages. She pulled out another set of forms. These are asset disclosure worksheets. Fill them out completely, including anything you might have forgotten or overlooked. Your interior design business, for instance. How is it structured? Are there contracts or commissions that extend beyond the divorce timeline? I thought about the Morrison project Caroline had called about, along with 3 other major contracts I'd secured for the fall season. My business was thriving, which suddenly felt like a strategic advantage rather than just professional satisfaction. There's substantial income potential, I said, more than Ryan realizes. Actually, I've been reinvesting most of the profits back into the business, but the client base has grown significantly this year. Margaret's eyes lit up with what I was beginning to recognize as her strategic thinking expression. Excellent. Business growth during marriage is typically considered marital property, but there are ways to protect future earnings. We'll need to move quickly on some restructuring. She handed me a business card for someone named Patricia Winters. She's the best divorce attorney in Portland, and more importantly, she's someone who understands that sometimes the legal system needs creative interpretation. Tell her I sent you, and tell her it's urgent. The third item she gave me was a small notebook. Start keeping a detailed journal of every interaction, every conversation, every observation about their behavior, dates, times, witnesses, if any. This will be crucial for establishing patterns of misconduct. As I examined the materials she'd provided, I realized Margaret had come to this meeting prepared. She'd anticipated my need for help, and had already assembled the tools for a comprehensive response. Margaret, I said, looking up from the documents, why are you helping me? We barely know each other. Her expression softened slightly, revealing glimpses of the woman behind the strategic mind, because 32 years ago, I was in a very similar situation. A beautiful young woman, a weak husband, and a naive wife, who thought love and loyalty were enough to protect her marriage. She paused, her eyes distant with memory. I handled it poorly. I was too trusting, too willing to believe that reasonable people could work things out reasonably. By the time I realized I was in a war, I'd already lost most of the battles. What happened? I lost everything, Margaret said, simply. My home, my financial security, even my relationship with my children for several years. My ex-husband's new wife was very skilled at manipulation, and she convinced him that a clean break from his old life was best for everyone. The pain in her voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. This wasn't ancient history for Margaret, it was a wound that had shaped the rest of her life. But I learned from those mistakes, she continued, her voice regaining its strength. I went to law school at 45, specialized in family law, and spent the next 3 decades, making sure other women didn't suffer the same fate I did. The revelation recontextualized everything about Margaret's involvement in my situation. This wasn't neighborly concern, it was personal mission. I won't make the same mistakes twice, I said, meeting her gaze directly. No, Margaret agreed. You won't, because you have something I didn't have, advance warning, and expert guidance. She closed the portfolio and leaned back in her chair. Now, let's talk about immediate strategy. Your houseguest needs to be removed from your home as quickly as possible, but it needs to be done in a way that exposes their relationship publicly and creates legal advantages for your divorce proceedings. The calculating tone in her voice sent a thrill of anticipation through me. Finally, I was moving from victim to strategist. How do we do that? I asked. Margaret's smile was predatory. We give them exactly what they think they want, but on our terms and in our time. Vanessa believes she's won because she's successfully established herself in your home, and your marriage. She's overconfident, which makes her careless. She stood and moved to her window, gesturing for me to join her. From her living room, we had a perfect view of my backyard, where Ryan and Vanessa were apparently enjoying their private domestic bliss. Look, Margaret said, pointing toward my patio. Through my kitchen windows, I could see Vanessa moving around with complete comfort,
reorganizing my spice rack, and rearranging my dish towels. She was nesting, claiming territory, making my space hers. She's documenting her presence, Margaret observed. That level of comfort suggests she believes this arrangement is permanent, which means she's not being careful about hiding the relationship anymore. As we watched, Ryan returned from his office visit, and the reunion scene that played out in my kitchen was sickeningly intimate.
He wrapped his arms around Vanessa from behind while she cooked, kissing her neck and murmuring something that made her laugh. They moved together with the ease of an established couple, completely comfortable in their shared deception. Perfect. Margaret murmured. They're performing their relationship for an audience they don't know exists. She moved to another window that provided a different angle of my property. Mrs. Chen next door is an early riser who tends her garden every morning. The Hendersons across the street both work from home. The Williams family has teenagers who are constantly coming and going. Your street has excellent natural surveillance. I was beginning to understand her strategy. You want them to be seen. I want them to be undeniably, publicly, irreversibly exposed. Margaret corrected. Not just seen, but witnessed by people who can testify to the timeline and nature of their relationship. She returned to her desk and pulled out a neighborhood directory. I've lived here for 15 years. I know everyone's schedules, their personalities, their willingness to get involved in neighborhood drama. We're going to create a situation where their affair becomes community knowledge. The tactical precision of her approach was breathtaking. This wasn't emotional revenge. It was strategic warfare designed to maximize legal and social consequences. What do you need me to do? I asked. For now, continue being the gracious, unsuspecting wife, Margaret replied. Let them get comfortable. Let them make mistakes. But document everything, and start laying groundwork for their removal. She handed me another business card. Dr. Helena Voss. She's a psychologist who specializes in adultery and emotional abuse cases. You need to start seeing her immediately. I don't need therapy, I said, bristling at the suggestion. This isn't about your mental health, Margaret explained patiently. This is about establishing a professional record of the emotional trauma their behavior has caused. Voss will document the impact of their affair on your psychological well-being, which can be crucial for spousal support calculations. Everything Margaret suggested had multiple purposes, all designed to strengthen my position in the eventual legal proceeding. She was thinking several moves ahead, anticipating challenges I hadn't even considered yet. When should I file for divorce? I asked. Margaret's expression turned serious. Not yet, right now. They hold most of the advantage. Ryan controls your joint finances. Vanessa has established residency in your home, and they can claim their relationship developed after your marriage was already failing. She returned to her portfolio and pulled out a timeline template. We need to document the pre-existing affair, establish their pattern of deception, and create circumstances where Ryan's financial misconduct becomes provable. Only then do we file. The methodical approach she outlined would require patience and self-control, qualities I wasn't sure I possessed while watching my husband play house with another woman in my home. How long? I asked. 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, Margaret replied. Long enough to build an unassailable case, but not so long that they can claim common-law marriage or other complications. 6 weeks of pretending to be oblivious while my marriage disintegrated in front of my eyes seemed like an eternity. But Margaret's track record spoke for itself, and I was beginning to trust her strategic instincts more than my emotional impulses. There's one more thing, Margaret said, her tone becoming even more serious. Once we begin this process, there's no going back. We're not trying to save your marriage or reconcile with Ryan. We're trying to destroy their relationship and ensure you emerge from this divorce with maximum financial and social advantages. The finality of her words should have frightened me, but instead I felt a surge of relief. Someone else was finally acknowledging that my marriage was beyond saving, and that the only rational response was to fight for my own interests. I understand, I said. Margaret studied my face for a long moment, then nodded with satisfaction. Good. Then let's begin planning their downfall. She opened her calendar and began scheduling our next steps: meetings with attorneys, appointments with Dr. Voss, surveillance opportunities, and strategic interventions designed to expose Ryan and Vanessa's affair to maximum effect. As I left Margaret's house an hour later, my arms full of documents and my mind buzzing with strategy, I felt transformed. The devastated wife who had knocked on Margaret's door had been replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Vanessa and Ryan thought they were playing a game where the rules favored them. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The following Monday morning, I sat across from Patricia Winters in her downtown Portland office, watching as the city's most formidable divorce attorney reviewed the documentation Margaret and I had assembled over the weekend. Patricia was exactly what I'd expected from Margaret's description: sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, and radiating the kind of controlled intensity that made opposing counsel reconsider their strategy. "This is excellent preliminary work," Patricia said, setting down the asset disclosure forms I'd completed. "Your neighbor certainly knows what she's doing." Margaret Thornton was legendary in family court before she retired. The office around us spoke of success and power, floor-to-ceiling law books, awards from legal organizations, and photographs of Patricia with various judges and politicians. This was clearly someone who operated at the highest levels of the legal profession. "What's our timeline?" I asked, noting how Patricia's use of "our" made me feel like I'd acquired a powerful ally rather than simply hired professional services. "Margaret's instincts are correct about waiting to file," Patricia replied, pulling out a legal pad, covered with notes. "Oregon's divorce laws favor documentation over accusations. The more evidence we have of financial misconduct and deliberate deception, the stronger our position becomes." She leaned back in her leather chair, her fingers steepled as she studied my face. "But I want to be completely clear about what we're undertaking here. This isn't going to be a collaborative divorce or mediated settlement. We're preparing for war, and wars have casualties." The martial language she used should have been intimidating, but instead it felt energizing. After days of feeling powerless while watching my marriage crumble, the prospect of taking decisive action was intoxicating. "I'm ready for war," I said without hesitation. Patricia's smile was sharp and approving. "Good, because based on what you've told me about Vanessa's behavior, she's not going to retreat quietly when we start applying pressure. Women like her don't give up easily once they've decided they want something." She opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across her desk. "I've been researching your husband's business dealings, and there are some interesting irregularities that could work in our favor." The documents appeared to be corporate filings and financial records related to Ryan's real estate development company. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked. "Ryan's been very creative with his bookkeeping over the past year," Patricia explained, pointing to highlighted sections of the paperwork. "There are several large cash transfers between his business accounts and personal accounts that don't correspond to any documented business expenses or salary distributions." She pulled out a calculator and began running numbers. "Based on these records, he's moved approximately $68,000 from company funds to personal use, without proper documentation. In Oregon, that constitutes both tax fraud and potential theft from business partners." The implications of her discovery sent a chill through me. Ryan hadn't just been emotionally unfaithful, he'd been stealing from his own company to fund his lifestyle with Vanessa. "Can we prove he used that money for the affair?" I asked. Patricia's expression turned predatory. "We can certainly create a compelling timeline. Large cash withdrawals that correspond to expensive dinners, hotel stays, jewelry purchases. The pattern is quite damning when presented properly." She handed me a subpoena template. "We'll need banking records for all his accounts, both business and personal, credit card statements, expense reports, anything that shows financial activity over the past 6 months." The thoroughness of her approach was both impressive and slightly terrifying. This wasn't just about divorce. It was about systematically destroying Ryan's financial credibility and potentially exposing him to criminal charges. "What about Vanessa?" I asked. "Can we take legal action against her directly?" "Oregon doesn't recognize alienation of affection claims," Patricia replied, "but there are other avenues. If we can prove she knowingly interfered with your marriage while your husband was using stolen funds to support her, we might have grounds for civil fraud charge." The possibilities she outlined painted a picture of comprehensive legal warfare that would leave both Ryan and Vanessa facing serious consequences for their actions. It was exactly the kind of thorough response their betrayal deserved. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, her tone becoming even more serious. "I've done some research on Vanessa Cole, and her background is more interesting than she's probably told your husband." She handed me a manila folder containing what appeared to be court records and newspaper clipping. "Ms. Cole has been involved in 2 previous relationships with married men, both of which ended in acrimonious divorce proceedings. In one case, she was actually named as a co-defendant in a fraud lawsuit." The documents revealed a pattern of behavior that made Vanessa's current actions seem less like passionate romance and more like calculated predation. She wasn't just Ryan's lost love, she was a woman who made a habit of targeting married men with financial resources. "This changes everything," I said, studying the evidence of Vanessa's history. "She's not some innocent woman who fell in love with the wrong person. She's a professional homewrecker." "Exactly," Patricia agreed, "and that pattern of behavior will be devastating to their credibility in court. Judges don't look kindly on individuals who make a practice of destroying marriages for financial gain." The revelation transformed my understanding of the entire situation. Ryan wasn't having a midlife crisis or reconnecting with a lost love. He was being systematically manipulated by someone who had perfected the art of stealing other women's husbands. "How do we use this information?" I asked. Patricia began organizing the documents into strategic piles. "Carefully and at precisely the right moment. If we reveal what we know too early, they'll have time to create counter-narratives or take defensive measures. But when deployed correctly, this information will be devastating." She outlined a timeline that would gradually increase pressure on both Ryan and Vanessa while building an overwhelming case for the divorce proceeding. The strategy was complex and multi-layered, involving financial investigations, surveillance, witness interviews, and strategic revelations designed to maximum impact. "I need you to continue acting completely normal at home," Patricia instructed. "Don't let them suspect that you know about Vanessa's history or Ryan's financial misconduct. We want them to feel secure and comfortable so they continue making mistakes." The requirement to maintain my facade of ignorance while living with my husband and his mistress felt like an impossible challenge, but Patricia's confidence in our eventual victory made the temporary discomfort seem worthwhile. After leaving Patricia's office, I drove to my appointment with Dr. Helena Voss, the psychologist Margaret had recommended. Her practice was located in a converted Victorian house in the Pearl District, and the waiting room had been designed to promote calm and confidentiality. Voss herself was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and an immediately trustworthy demeanor. She invited me into her office, which felt more like an elegant living room than a clinical space, and offered me tea before settling into her chair with a notepad. "Margaret Thornton explained your situation in general terms," Dr. Voss began, "but I'd like to hear your perspective on what you've been experiencing." For the next hour I found myself describing not just the recent discovery of Ryan's affair, but months of subtle changes in our relationship that I'd dismissed or rationalized. The gradual withdrawal of affection, the increasing criticism of my work and appearance, the way he'd begun treating me like a roommate rather than a wife. "What you're describing is a classic pattern of emotional disengagement," Dr. Voss explained, taking notes as I spoke. "Many people who are having affairs begin unconsciously preparing their spouse for abandonment by creating emotional distance and manufacturing reasons for dissatisfaction." Her clinical perspective on Ryan's behavior helped me understand that his transformation hadn't been sudden or inexplicable. It had been a deliberate process designed to make our eventual separation seem inevitable rather than his choice. "The goal," Dr. Voss continued, "is to rewrite the marriage narrative so that the affair appears to be the result of marital problems rather than the cause of them." She asked detailed questions about specific incidents and conversations, documenting the timeline of Ryan's emotional withdrawal and its impact on my mental health and self-esteem. The session was both therapeutic and strategic, creating a professional record of the psychological damage his affair had caused. "I'll be preparing a comprehensive report," Dr. Voss explained, as our session concluded,
that documents the emotional abuse and manipulation you've experienced. This will be valuable evidence in your divorce proceedings. The clinical validation of my experiences was profoundly empowering. For months I'd questioned my own perceptions and blamed myself for our relationship problem. Now I understood that I'd been the target of a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation. That evening I returned home to find Ryan and Vanessa cooking dinner together in my kitchen, their easy intimacy a stark contrast to the strained interactions Ryan and I had been having for months. They looked up when I entered, their faces showing a mixture of guilt and defiance that confirmed they'd been discussing their future plans. "How was your day?" Ryan asked, his tone carrying the false brightness of someone trying too hard to appear normal. "Productive," I replied truthfully, setting my purse down and observing their domestic scene with new eyes. Several client meetings, some administrative tasks, the usual. Vanessa was wearing one of my aprons, a small detail that irritated me more than the larger violations of my space. She'd tied it with a little bow at the back, looking like she was playing house in someone else's life. "We're making Thai curry," Vanessa announced, stirring something that smelled delicious despite my resentment of her presence. I lived in Bangkok for 6 months during my modeling career, so I learned to cook authentic recipes. The casual mention of her international travel and modeling career was clearly designed to highlight her sophisticated background compared to my presumably provincial existence. Every conversation with Vanessa contained these subtle comparisons, small ways of establishing her superiority. "How exotic," I said, pouring myself a glass of wine from a bottle they'd already opened. "I'm sure Ryan appreciates your worldly experience." Ryan shot me a sharp look, sensing the edge in my voice but unsure how to respond. He was caught between wanting to defend Vanessa and not wanting to openly insult his wife. The conflict was written clearly across his face. During dinner I practiced the performance Patricia had coached me on, appearing interested in their conversation while carefully observing their interactions, for evidence I could use later. They spoke with the easy familiarity of people who'd been intimate for months, sharing inside jokes and references that excluded me from their dynamic. "Vanessa was telling me about this amazing property in Costa Rica," Ryan said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "A boutique hotel opportunity that could be perfect for expansion." The casual way he discussed international business ventures with his mistress while I sat at the same table was breathtaking in its audacity. He was already making plans for their future together, plans that apparently involved my financial support through our joint assets. "Sounds expensive," I observed, taking another sip of wine and watching their reaction. "Well, yes," Ryan replied, "but the potential returns are incredible. Sometimes you have to take risks to achieve real success." The irony of him lecturing me about taking risks while conducting an affair in our home wasn't lost on me, but I maintained my composed expression and nodded as if I found his business wisdom enlightening. After dinner, Ryan announced that he had some work to catch up on and disappeared into his office, leaving Vanessa and me alone in the kitchen. She began cleaning up with practiced efficiency, moving around my space with increasing confidence. "Natalie," she said without looking up from the dishes she was washing, "I want to thank you for being so understanding about this situation." The comment was so absurd that I almost laughed. "Understanding about me staying here temporarily," Vanessa clarified, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what she was really talking about. "I know it must be awkward having a house guest, especially one with history with Ryan." Her careful phrasing was designed to sound innocent while actually acknowledging the true nature of our situation. She was testing my awareness, trying to determine how much I knew or suspected about their relationship. "Ryan's always been generous about helping people in need," I replied carefully. "It's one of his better qualities." Vanessa's smile turned slightly predatory. "He really is wonderful, isn't he? So successful, so ambitious. He has such clear vision about what he wants from life." The emphasis she placed on what he wants was clearly meant to suggest that those desires didn't include me. She was becoming bolder in her psychological warfare, confident enough to drop increasingly obvious hints about their relationship. "Yes," I agreed. "Ryan's always been very focused on getting what he wants." We finished cleaning the kitchen in silence, but I could feel Vanessa's calculating gaze on me, as she tried to read my true feelings about the situation. She was clearly frustrated by my lack of emotional reaction, having expected tears or confrontation rather than composed civility. Later that evening, as I worked on client presentations in my home office, I could hear Ryan and Vanessa's voices drifting from the living room below. Their conversation was too quiet for me to make out specific words, but the intimate tone and occasional laughter painted a clear picture of their relationship dynamic. Around 10 o'clock I heard footsteps on the stairs and the sound of the guest room door closing. Ryan appeared in our bedroom doorway a few minutes later, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact as he went through his nightly routine. "Natalie," he said as he climbed into bed beside me, "we should probably talk about the living arrangement." The euphemistic phrase, living arrangements, to describe his mistress taking up residence in our home was typically Ryan. He'd always been skilled at minimizing uncomfortable realities through careful word choice. "What about them?" I asked, not looking up from my laptop. "Well, it's been a few days now, and I think we all need to establish some boundaries and expectations," he continued, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when trying to manipulate situations to his advantage. "What kind of boundaries did you have in mind?" I asked, curious to hear how he planned to justify the unjustifiable. Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside me. "I think we need to acknowledge that our marriage has been struggling for a while. We've both been unhappy, and maybe it's time to consider that we might want different things from life." The careful way he constructed his argument, making our marital problems sound mutual and inevitable, demonstrated exactly the kind of narrative rewriting Dr. Voss had described. He was preparing me for abandonment while making it sound like a collaborative decision. "Have we been struggling?" I asked, finally looking up from my computer. "I wasn't aware that you were unhappy." "Come on, Natalie," Ryan said, his frustration showing through his diplomatic facade. "You can't tell me you haven't noticed the distance between us. We barely talk anymore, we don't share the same interests, we want different things from the future." The projection was stunning in its completeness. He was describing his own behavior, his own withdrawal and disengagement, but attributing it to me, and to us collectively. "What different things do we want?" I pressed, determined to make him articulate his real intentions. "I want adventure, travel, new experiences," Ryan replied, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme. "I want to take risks, build something bigger than just a comfortable suburban life. You're content with your design business and this house, but I need more than that." The speech sounded rehearsed, as if he'd been practicing it in preparation for this conversation. I suspected Vanessa had helped him craft these justifications, coaching him on how to make his abandonment sound like personal growth rather than betrayal. "And Vanessa shares these same ambitions?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Ryan's pause was telling. "Vanessa understands my vision for the future. She's lived all over the world, she's taken risks, she's not afraid of change." The contrast he was drawing between Vanessa's supposed adventurous spirit and my alleged timidity was clearly designed to make his choice seem obvious and justified. She was the exciting future, I was the boring past. "I see," I said simply, closing my laptop and setting it aside. "And what exactly are you proposing?" "I think we should consider a trial separation," Ryan said, the words coming out in a rush as if he'd been holding them back for days. "Some time apart to figure out what we both really want. A trial separation that would conveniently allow him to live openly with Vanessa, while maintaining access to our joint assets and avoiding the complications of immediate divorce proceedings." It was a transparent attempt to have everything he wanted without facing any consequences. "Where would you go during this separation?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I was thinking I could stay in the guest room temporarily," Ryan replied, not quite meeting my "until I find something more permanent." The audacity was breathtaking. He wanted to conduct his affair openly in our home, while framing it as a trial separation for the sake of our marriage. He was asking me to subsidize his relationship with another woman while he decided whether he wanted to keep me or trade me in for a newer model. "And Vanessa?" I pressed. "Would she be staying here during your period of self-discovery?" Ryan's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Vanessa's housing situation is separate from our marital issues. She's a friend who needs help, and I'm not going to abandon her just because you're feeling insecure." The gaslighting was masterful in its execution. He was reframing my legitimate anger about his affair as insecurity about a friend's housing needs. According to his narrative, I was the problem for being unreasonable about his generous hospitality. "How thoughtful of you to be so concerned about her welfare," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm he was too self-absorbed to notice. "Look," Ryan said, his tone becoming more aggressive, "I'm trying to handle this situation with maturity and consideration for everyone involved, but you're making it difficult by being suspicious and hostile about everything." He was actually positioning himself as the victim in this scenario, the reasonable party trying to navigate a complex situation while dealing with an unreasonable wife. The psychological manipulation was so complete that I almost admired its artistry. "I'll think about your proposal," I said finally, turning away from him and settling into my pillow. Ryan looked surprised by my calm response.
He'd clearly expected more drama, more emotional pleading that would justify his decision to leave me for Vanessa. My composed reaction seemed to unnerve him more than tears or anger would have. "Good," he said uncertainly. "I think that's the mature approach." As Ryan settled into bed beside me, I lay awake planning my next moves in the elaborate chess game Margaret and Patricia had designed. Ryan thought he was controlling the situation, but he was actually walking directly into the trap we'd prepared for him. The following morning, I implemented the next phase of our strategy. While Ryan and Vanessa enjoyed their breakfast routine, I called my assistant Caroline and arranged to work from the office more frequently, ostensibly to give the happy couple more privacy, but actually to create opportunities for surveillance and documentation. "I'll be in and out more often over the next few weeks," I told them as I gathered my work materials. "Some of my clients prefer in-person consultations, and I have several site visits scheduled." The relief on both their faces was immediate and obvious. They wanted me gone so they could play house without the inconvenience of my presence. "That sounds great," Vanessa said with artificial enthusiasm. "It'll give me more time to really settle in and maybe do some organizing around the house." The phrase, "settle in," confirmed what I already suspected. Vanessa had no intention of leaving. She was establishing permanent residence in my home, gradually taking over my role as lady of the house. "How thoughtful," I replied. "Just be sure to ask before moving anything important. Some of the artwork and antiques are quite valuable." The subtle warning was designed to plant seeds of doubt about her growing presumption of ownership. I wanted her to know that I was watching, even if I wasn't actively confronting her behavior. As I drove to my first surveillance appointment with Margaret, I reflected on how drastically my life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, I'd been a happily married woman, focused on building her interior design business. Now I was a strategic warrior plotting the destruction of my husband's affair and his mistress's reputation. The transformation should have been traumatic, but instead it felt liberating. For the first time in months, I had purpose and direction. I was no longer passively accepting whatever scraps of attention Ryan chose to offer me. I was actively working to reclaim my power and my future. Margaret was waiting in her garden when I arrived, but instead of tending her roses, she was positioned with a clear view of my house. Her expression was sharp with anticipation, as she gestured for me to join her. "They didn't waste any time," she said, pointing toward my kitchen windows. Through the glass I could see Ryan and Vanessa engaged in what could only be described as a romantic scene. He had her pressed against my granite countertop, kissing her with the kind of passion he hadn't shown me in months. Their body language spoke of complete comfort and established intimacy. "Perfect," Margaret murmured, raising a small camera with a telephoto lens. "The lighting is excellent, and the kitchen window provides a clear view of their faces." She took several photographs, documenting their affair with professional precision. The images would provide undeniable evidence of their relationship's physical nature and its occurrence in the marital home. "Mrs. Chen is in her garden," Margaret noted, gesturing toward the neighboring property. "She's pretending to weed, but she's definitely watching your kitchen window." Mrs. Chen was an elderly Korean woman who ran the neighborhood watch program with military efficiency. If she witnessed Ryan and Vanessa's display of affection, the entire street would know about it within hours. "Should I go talk to her?" I asked. "Not yet," Margaret replied. "Let her reach her own conclusions first. When we do approach her for a witness statement, we want her testimony to be based on her independent observations, not anything we've told her. The strategic thinking behind every move continued to impress me. Margaret and Patricia were building a case that would be unassailable in court, anticipating every possible challenge or counter-argument. As we watched, Ryan and Vanessa's intimate moment escalated into something even more inappropriate for a kitchen window. Margaret continued photographing while providing a running commentary on the legal implications of their behavior. Public display of adultery in the marital home, she noted with satisfaction. Witnessed by neighbors, documented with photographic evidence. Occurring during business hours when Ryan should presumably be working. The last point was particularly significant, as it suggested he was spending company time conducting personal affairs, rather than focusing on his professional responsibility. After documenting sufficient evidence of their morning activities, Margaret and I retreated to her house to review our progress and plan the next phase of operation. The kitchen table was covered with photographs, legal documents, financial records and timeline charts that resembled a military command center more than a residential dining room. Patricia called this morning, Margaret reported as she organized the latest photographs into evidence folder. She's obtained preliminary banking records that show even more concerning financial patterns. She handed me a printout that highlighted several large cash withdrawals and unexplained transfers between Ryan's business and personal accounts. The amounts were significant enough to suggest systematic theft rather than occasional poor judgment. "This is substantial money," I said, studying the highlighted transactions. "If he's been stealing from his business partners, the consequences could be severe." "Exactly," Margaret agreed. "Patricia thinks we might be able to pursue criminal charges in addition to the divorce proceedings. Embezzlement is a felony in Oregon, and the evidence is becoming quite compelling." The possibility of Ryan facing criminal prosecution for his financial misconduct added an entirely new dimension to our strategy. This wasn't just about divorce anymore. It was about holding him accountable for a pattern of illegal behavior. "What about Vanessa's involvement?" I asked. Margaret smiled grimly and pulled out another folder containing the research Patricia had compiled on Vanessa's background. "That's where things get really interesting. It turns out Miss Cole has been quite busy since returning to Portland." The documents revealed that Vanessa had been involved with at least 2 other married men since moving back to Oregon, both of whom had experienced suspicious financial difficulties during their relationships with her. "She's not just a homewrecker," Margaret explained. "She's running what amounts to a confidence scheme. She targets successful married men, seduces them into affairs, and then manipulates them into making poor financial decisions that benefit her." The pattern was so clear and so calculated that it was difficult to understand how intelligent men continued falling for her manipulations. But then again, Ryan had always been susceptible to flattery and ego stroking. "How do we prove her involvement in Ryan's financial misconduct?" I asked. "We don't have to prove it directly," Margaret replied. "We just have to establish the timeline and let the implications speak for themselves. Jury members aren't stupid. They can connect the dots between Ryan's affair and his sudden willingness to steal from his business." The strategic elegance of the approach was becoming clear. We didn't need to prove conspiracy. We just needed to demonstrate that Ryan's affair had corrupted his judgment and led to illegal behavior. As Margaret and I continued planning our campaign against Ryan and Vanessa, I felt a sense of purpose and empowerment that had been missing from my life for months. They had underestimated me, assuming I would accept their betrayal passively and disappear quietly from their lives. They were about to discover how wrong they were. 3 weeks into our surveillance operation, I was reviewing Patricia's latest financial discoveries when my phone rang with devastating news. My mother's voice was shaking as she told me that my father had suffered a massive heart attack and was in critical condition at Oregon Health Sciences University Hospital. "The doctors aren't sure he's going to make it through the night," Mom said, her words punctuated by sobs. "You need to come now, Natalie, right now." I hung up the phone with trembling hands, my carefully orchestrated plans suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the possibility of losing my father. Within minutes I was grabbing my keys and heading for the hospital, my mind racing between worry for Dad and the logistics of leaving Ryan and Vanessa unsupervised during such a critical phase of our evidence gathering. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and mounting panic. My father had always been the steady presence in my life, the one person who offered unconditional love and support without agenda or manipulation. The thought of losing him now, when everything else in my world was crumbling, felt like more than I could bear. I found my mother in the cardiac intensive care unit waiting room, surrounded by my aunts and cousins who had driven up from Eugene. Mom looked smaller than I remembered, aged by fear and exhaustion. When she saw me, she collapsed into my arms with relief. "He was working in the garden," she whispered against my shoulder, "just fell over by the tomato plants." The neighbor heard me screaming and called the ambulance. The image of my father, who had always seemed invincible to me, lying helpless among his beloved vegetable garden, was almost too painful to process. He was only 63, still young by today's standards, still full of plans for retirement travel and grandchildren he hoped to spoil someday. Dr. Martinez, the cardiac surgeon, emerged from the ICU with the grave expression I'd learned to recognize from too many medical drama. His explanation of my father's condition was clinical but compassionate: massive damage to the left ventricle, multiple blockages, surgical intervention planned for the morning if he's stabilized enough to survive the procedure. "The next 24 hours are critical," Dr. Martinez explained. "We're doing everything we can to keep him stable, but I won't lie to you, this is very serious." I spent the night in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside my father's bed, watching the monitors that tracked his vital signs and listening to the mechanical rhythm of the machines, keeping him alive. His face was pale and peaceful, making him look older than his years, but also somehow more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. Around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Ryan: "Heard about your dad, so sorry. Take all the time you need." The message was followed by another: "Don't worry about anything at home. Vanessa and I will handle everything." The casual way he grouped himself with Vanessa as a team that would handle everything in my absence was infuriating, but I was too emotionally drained to feel the full impact of his insensitivity. My father was fighting for his life and Ryan was worried about household management. Margaret appeared in the waiting room around 6 in the morning, carrying coffee and pastries from the hospital cafe. She'd somehow learned about my father's condition and driven across town to offer support, a gesture that meant more to me than I could express. "How is?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent time in hospital waiting rooms. "Surgery this morning," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "If he's strong enough to survive it." Margaret nodded with understanding. "I went through this with my own father 20 years ago. Triple bypass surgery, in the ICU for weeks. The waiting is the hardest part." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the early morning activity of the hospital as day shift nurses arrived and night shift staff prepared to leave. The ritual of institutional transition was oddly comforting in its predictability. "I should tell you," Margaret said eventually, "that our subjects have been quite active since you left yesterday. Very active, in fact." Despite my exhaustion and worry, I felt a spark of interest. "What kind of act?" Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photographs she'd taken from her garden. The images showed Ryan and Vanessa on my back patio, sharing what appeared to be a champagne toast in broad daylight. They looked celebratory, almost triumphant, as if they were marking some kind of victory. "This was around 7 o'clock last night," Margaret explained. "About an hour after you left for the hospital. They seemed to be celebrating something. The timing was significant. They'd waited barely an hour after learning about my family emergency before openly celebrating their freedom from my presence. The callousness was breathtaking even by their standards." "There's more," Margaret continued, scrolling through additional photos. "Miss Chen wasn't the only one who noticed their behavior. The Henderson teenagers were outside playing basketball and got quite an education in adult relationships. The implications were perfect for our legal strategy. Multiple witnesses, including minors, had observed Ryan and Vanessa's inappropriate public displays of affection. The timing, just after my father's heart attack, would make their behavior appear particularly heartless to a jury. I've been documenting everything," Margaret assured me. "Patricia knows about your situation and has adjusted our timeline accordingly. The evidence gathering continues even while you're dealing with family matters." The relief of knowing that our legal strategy wouldn't be derailed by my father's medical crisis was enormous. Margaret and Patricia had anticipated this kind of complication and planned accordingly. My father's surgery began at 10 o'clock that morning and lasted nearly 6 hours. The waiting room filled and emptied with various family members and friends, who came to offer support and then returned to their own lives. I remained constant,
unable to leave until I knew he would survive. Dr. Martinez emerged from surgery looking cautiously optimistic. "We were able to clear the blockages and repair most of the damage," he reported. "The next 48 hours will tell us how well his heart responds to the intervention." The relief was overwhelming, but tempered by the understanding that my father's recovery would be long and uncertain. I would need to be available to help my mother navigate the complexities of cardiac rehabilitation and lifestyle changes that lay ahead. That evening, as I finally allowed myself to consider returning home, my phone rang with a call from Caroline, my assistant. Her voice was tight with anger, as she described a conversation she'd had with someone claiming to represent my business. "Some woman called this afternoon saying she was your new business partner," Caroline reported. "She wanted access to all our client files and current project information. Said you'd authorized her to help manage things while you dealt with family issues." The blood drained from my face as I realized what was happening. "What woman?" She said her name was Vanessa. "Claimed you'd given her permission to help coordinate your projects while you were at the hospital. I told her I'd never heard of her and that I'd need written authorization from you before sharing any confidential information." Vanessa was making a play for my business, using my father's medical emergency as an opportunity to insert herself into my professional life. The audacity was staggering, but it also revealed the extent of her long-term planning. "You did exactly right," I told Caroline. "Under no circumstances should you share any business information with that woman. She has no authority to represent me or my company." "I figured something was off," Caroline replied. "She seemed to know a lot about your personal situation, things about your marriage and your house that seemed weird for a business partner to know." The conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. Vanessa and Ryan had been discussing their plans for my future, including taking over my business relationship. They weren't just stealing my husband and my home, they were positioning themselves to claim my professional reputation as well. I called Patricia immediately to report this latest development. Her response was swift and strategic. "This is perfect," Patricia said, her excitement evident even over the phone. "She's just committed attempted fraud by misrepresenting herself as your business partner. We can add this to the growing list of charges we're building against her." The legal implications of Vanessa's overreach were significant, but the personal violation felt even more devastating. My business was something I'd built independently, a source of identity and accomplishment that had nothing to do with my marriage to Ryan. Her attempt to colonize that part of my life represented a level of presumption that went beyond mere adultery. "I want to go home," I told Patricia. "I need to confront this directly." "Not yet," Patricia cautioned. "Let them continue making mistakes. The more overconfident they become, the more evidence they'll provide for our case." The strategic patience she counseled was difficult to maintain when every instinct screamed for immediate confrontation. But Patricia's legal expertise had proven reliable, and I forced myself to trust her judgment. I spent 3 more days at the hospital, watching my father's gradual improvement, and helping my mother adjust to the new reality of his cardiac condition. By the time I felt comfortable leaving them, Dad was stable enough to be moved to a regular room, and beginning the slow process of cardiac rehabilitation. During those hospital days, Margaret provided regular updates on the situation at my house. Ryan and Vanessa had apparently decided that my absence was an opportunity to accelerate their domestic arrangements. She'd moved her belongings into the master bedroom, taken over my closet space, and begun redecorating my living room according to her preference. "She's nesting," Margaret observed during one of our coffee conversations in the hospital cafe. "Creating a permanent living situation while you're distracted by family obligations." The photographs Margaret showed me documented a systematic takeover of my personal space. Vanessa had replaced my carefully chosen artwork with her own pieces, rearranged my furniture, and even changed the linens on my bed. She was erasing my presence from my own home. "The most interesting development," Margaret continued, "is that she's been receiving professional visitors, it appears." She showed me images of several well-dressed individuals arriving at my house for what appeared to be business meetings. The visitors carried briefcases and laptops, suggesting formal transactions rather than social calls. I think she's conducting business from your home, Margaret said, using your address as her base of operations for whatever schemes she's running. The implications were staggering. Not only was Vanessa living in my house and sleeping with my husband, but she was also using my property as headquarters for potentially fraudulent activities. The legal exposure this created for me was serious enough to warrant immediate action. I called Patricia from the hospital parking lot and explained what Margaret had observed. Her response was immediate and decisive. "You need to return home today," Patricia said. "If she's conducting business from your property, you could be held liable for any illegal activity. We need to document what's happening and take steps to protect you from criminal exposure." The urgency in Patricia's voice convinced me that the situation had escalated beyond strategic patience. I needed to act before Vanessa's schemes created legal problems that could destroy my life entirely. The drive home from the hospital felt like traveling toward a battlefield. My father was stable but would need weeks of recovery. My mother was overwhelmed but coping, and I was returning to a house that had been transformed into enemy territory during my absence. Margaret was waiting in her garden when I pulled into my driveway, her expression grim with anticipation. She gestured toward my front door, where I noticed that the landscape lighting had been changed and new planters had been installed. Even the exterior of my house looked different. "They've been busy," Margaret said, as I joined her at the fence separating our properties. "Vanessa's been directing landscaping crews and furniture delivery trucks like she owns the place." The transformation of my home's exterior was disorienting enough, but I knew the interior changes would be even more dramatic. Vanessa had clearly used my absence to establish complete dominance over my living space. "Are they home now?" I asked, noting that Ryan's car was missing from the driveway. "They left about an hour ago," Margaret replied. "Some kind of business meeting downtown, but they should be back soon." The temporary emptiness of my house provided an opportunity to assess the changes privately before confronting Ryan and Vanessa directly. I needed to understand the full extent of their alterations before planning my response. The moment I stepped through my front door, I understood that this was no longer my home. The interior had been completely transformed according to Vanessa's aesthetic preferences, which apparently favored bold colors and dramatic contrasts over the subtle elegance I'd spent years perfecting. My carefully curated living room had been turned into something that resembled a magazine spread from a completely different design philosophy. The furniture had been rearranged, the color scheme altered, and my personal photographs replaced with generic art that meant nothing to me. In the kitchen, I discovered that Vanessa had installed new appliances and changed the hardware on my custom cabinets. The modifications were expensive and extensive, suggesting she'd spent considerable money on improvements she had no right to make. The master bedroom was the most shocking transformation. My bed had been replaced with something larger and more ornate. The closet had been completely reorganized to accommodate Vanessa's wardrobe, and my personal belongings had been relegated to a single dresser drawer. On the nightstand beside what was now clearly Vanessa's side of the bed, I found a stack of business cards and legal documents that explained the professional visitors Margaret had observed. Vanessa was apparently running some kind of consulting business, using my home address as her corporate headquarters. The documents revealed that she'd established herself as a relationship consultant, specializing in helping women navigate complex personal situations. The irony of a professional homewrecker offering relationship advice was almost too perfect to believe, but the most disturbing discovery was a folder containing what appeared to be dossiers on several other married couples in Portland's affluent neighborhood. Each file contained detailed information about the husband's financial assets, business interests, and apparent marital vulnerabilities. Vanessa wasn't just stealing my husband, she was running a comprehensive operation targeting multiple wealthy men for systematic exploitation. Ryan was apparently just one client in a broader criminal enterprise. I photographed every document, every business card, every piece of evidence that revealed the scope of Vanessa's activities. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was organized fraud operating from my home and using my resource. The sound of car doors slamming in my driveway announced Ryan and Vanessa's return. I quickly returned the documents to their original positions and positioned myself in the living room, waiting for their reaction to my unexpected presence. They entered together, their voices bright with conversation that died abruptly when they saw me sitting calmly on what used to be my sofa. The shock on their faces was immediately replaced by defensive anger, as if I were the intruder in this scenario. "Natalie," Ryan said, his voice carefully controlled, "we weren't expecting you back so soon. How's your father?" The polite inquiry about my father's health, delivered while standing in my redecorated living room beside his mistress, demonstrated Ryan's complete disconnection from normal human empathy. "He's recovering," I replied evenly. "The surgery was successful, though he'll need extensive rehabilitation." "That's wonderful news," Vanessa said with artificial warmth. "We've been so worried about you and your family." The performance of concern from the woman who had been celebrating my absence and colonizing my home was masterful in its audacity. She actually seemed to believe that her sympathy would be welcomed or believed. "I can see you've been busy while I was away," I said, gesturing around the transformed room. "The house looks very different." Ryan had the grace to look uncomfortable, but Vanessa stepped forward with confident explanation. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her tone suggesting she didn't actually care whether I minded or not. "I thought some updates might lift your spirits when you got back. The old decor was a bit dated, and I have experience in interior design." The claim that she had experience in my profession was particularly insulting, suggesting that my years of training and professional success were somehow inferior to her amateur dabbling. "How thoughtful," I replied. "I'm sure you invested considerable time and money in these improvements." "Well, Ryan was so generous about covering the costs," Vanessa said, apparently oblivious to the implications of her statement. "He said he wanted the house to feel more modern and welcoming." Ryan shot her a warning look, clearly uncomfortable with her casual admission that he'd been spending money on home improvements while I was dealing with a family medical emergency. "We should probably discuss the financial arrangements," I said, looking directly at Ryan. "I assume you kept receipts for all these purchases." The uncomfortable silence that followed suggested that financial record-keeping had not been a priority during their redecorating spree. Ryan's face flushed with the expression I'd learned to recognize when he was caught in questionable behavior.
"It wasn't that much money," he said defensively. "Just some paint and furniture. I thought you'd appreciate coming home to something fresh and updated." The minimization of what appeared to be thousands of dollars in unauthorized changes to my home was typical Ryan behavior. He'd always been skilled at reframing his poor decisions as thoughtful gestures that I should appreciate rather than question. "I'm sure the receipts will show the exact amounts," I said. "I'll need them for tax purposes, since these might qualify as business expenses for my design company." The suggestion that I might claim their unauthorized improvements as business deductions clearly hadn't occurred to either of them. Ryan's expression shifted to concern as he realized there could be financial implications to their redecorating project. "Actually," I continued, "I've been thinking about some business changes while I was at the hospital. Caroline mentioned that someone called claiming to be my new partner." Vanessa's confident expression faltered slightly, the first crack in her composed facade since I'd arrived home. "That was a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I was just trying to help coordinate things while you were dealing with your family emergency. I thought I could take some of the pressure off you." The explanation was delivered with such practiced sincerity that I almost admired her ability to reframe attempted fraud as thoughtful assistance. "How considerate," I replied. "Though I'm curious about your qualifications for managing interior design projects. Your business cards mention relationship consulting, which seems like a different field entirely." The reference to her business cards caused both Ryan and Vanessa to stiffen with alarm. They clearly hadn't expected me to discover her professional activities so quickly. "You went through my personal belongings?" Vanessa asked, her voice taking on an edge of righteous indignation. "I was looking for my own belongings," I replied calmly. since my bedroom seems to have been completely reorganized. Imagine my surprise to discover that my home has become the headquarters for a consulting business I knew nothing about. Ryan stepped forward, his protective instincts toward Vanessa overriding his awareness of how bad this looked for him. Vanessa's business activities are completely separate from our personal situation, he said firmly. You have no right to investigate her private affairs. The irony of Ryan lecturing me about respecting privacy while conducting an affair in my home was almost too perfect. But his defensive response also confirmed that he was fully aware of Vanessa's business activities and had approved her use of our home for professional purposes. Our home is being used as a business address without my consent, I said, my voice hardening with genuine anger. That creates legal liability for me. As the property owner, I have every right to know what business activities are being conducted on my property. The legal implications clearly hadn't occurred to either of them. They'd been so focused on their romantic drama that they'd ignored the practical consequences of their actions. Look, Ryan said, his tone becoming more conciliatory, maybe we can work something out. Some kind of arrangement that works for everyone. The suggestion that there was a compromise solution to his affair and Vanessa's business fraud demonstrated his complete inability to understand the gravity of what they'd done. What kind of arrangement did you have in mind? I asked, curious to hear how he planned to resolve the unreasonable. Ryan glanced at Vanessa, clearly looking for guidance on how to proceed. She nodded slightly, apparently giving him permission to continue with whatever plan they'd discussed. Well, Ryan said, his confidence returning, we've been talking about the future, and we think it might be best for everyone if we made some changes to our living situation. The euphemistic language he used to describe the end of our marriage was typical Ryan, avoiding direct confrontation while maneuvering toward his desired outcome. What changes specifically? I pressed. A permanent separation, Ryan said, the words coming out in a rush. With you keeping the house and me moving out to start fresh somewhere else. The proposal was clearly designed to sound generous while actually giving him everything he wanted. Freedom from our marriage, a clear conscience about abandoning me, and presumably access to our joint assets to fund his new life with Vanessa. And where would you go? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We've been looking at some properties, Vanessa interjected, apparently unable to contain her excitement about their plans. There's a beautiful place in the Pearl District that would be perfect for both of us. The use of both of us to describe their housing search confirmed that they'd been planning their future together for some time. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, it was the culmination of months of careful preparation. How romantic, I said. And how would this arrangement work financially? The practical question clearly made them uncomfortable. They'd been so focused on the emotional drama of their affair that they hadn't fully considered the financial logistics of divorce and property division. We'd work something out, Ryan said vaguely. Maybe you could buy out my share of the house, or we could sell it and split the proceeds. The casual way he discussed dismantling our shared financial life while his mistress stood beside him in my redecorated living room was breathtaking in its insensitivity. That's certainly one option, I agreed, though I should mention that I've been consulting with some attorneys about the legal implications of our situation. The mention of legal consultation caused both of them to go very still, their expressions shifting from confident to wary. What kind of legal implications? Ryan asked, his voice carefully controlled. Well, I said, settling back into my transformed sofa, it turns out that adultery, financial misconduct, and business fraud create quite a complex legal situation. My attorney found it all very interesting. The color drained from Ryan's face as he began to understand that their actions might have consequences beyond simple divorce proceedings. You're being dramatic, Vanessa said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. There's no fraud involved in anything we've done. Using my home as a business address without permission, misrepresenting yourself as my business partner, and taking money from joint accounts for personal use, I replied, ticking off the charges on my fingers. My attorney thinks there's quite a lot of fraud involved. The legal reality of their situation was finally beginning to penetrate their romantic delusions. They'd been so focused on their love story that they'd ignored the criminal implications of their behavior. Ryan sank into one of the chairs Vanessa had chosen for my living room, his face pale with realization. Natalie, please. We can work this out without involving lawyers. I'm afraid it's too late for that, I said, standing up and smoothing down my skirt. The legal process has already begun. The finality in my voice seemed to shock them both. They'd clearly expected me to be more pliable, more willing to accept their terms for the dissolution of my marriage. What does that mean? Vanessa asked, her composed mask finally slipping to reveal genuine fear. It means, I said, moving toward the door, that you should probably find somewhere else to stay tonight, and every night after that. The eviction notice was delivered with calm authority, but the impact on both of them was immediate and dramatic. This was clearly not the outcome they'd anticipated from their carefully planned revelation. You can't just throw me out, Vanessa protested. I have tenant rights. You're not a tenant, I replied firmly. You're a guest who has overstayed her welcome, and guests can be asked to leave at any time. The legal distinction between guest and tenant was one Patricia had prepared me for, and Vanessa's panicked response confirmed that she'd been counting on squatters' rights to maintain her position in my home. Ryan, she said, turning to him with desperate appeal, tell her she can't do this. But Ryan was staring at me with something that looked like respect mixed with fear. He was finally beginning to understand that I wasn't the passive victim he'd expected me to be. I think, Ryan said, slowly, we should probably do what Natalie suggests. The betrayal in Vanessa's eyes as her supposed champion abandoned her was almost satisfying enough to make up for months of humiliation. She'd counted on Ryan's protection, but he was clearly more concerned about his own legal exposure than her housing situation. Fine, Vanessa said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. But this isn't over. No, I agreed. It's not, but the next phase won't be taking place in my home. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, I felt a profound sense of reclaiming what had been stolen from me. My home, my dignity, and my power were returning to my control. The war wasn't over, but the first major battle had been decisively won. 2 months after evicting Ryan and Vanessa from my home, I stood in Patricia's conference room surrounded by boxes of evidence that would change their lives forever. The mahogany table was covered with financial records, photographs, witness statements, and legal documents that told the complete story of their deception and criminal activity. The grand jury returned indictments this morning, Patricia announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated a masterpiece of legal strategy. Ryan faces 12 counts of embezzlement and 3 counts of fraud. Vanessa faces charges for identity theft, business fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. The moment I'd been working toward for months had finally arrived, but the reality felt surreal. My husband and his mistress were now facing serious criminal charges that could result in years in prison. Margaret sat beside me reviewing the civil lawsuit documents with the keen eye of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. The asset forfeiture orders are particularly comprehensive, she noted with approval. They won't be able to access any of the money they stole or hide assets offshore. The financial investigation had revealed a scope of criminal activity that went far beyond Ryan's affair. His business partner David Morrison had been embezzling from their development company for over 2 years, using the stolen funds to finance an increasingly lavish lifestyle that included expensive gifts for Vanessa and trips to exotic locations. But it was Vanessa's operation that truly shocked everyone involved in the case. The relationship consulting business she'd been running from my home was actually an elaborate confidence scheme, targeting wealthy married men throughout the Pacific Northwest. She had active relationships with 7 different men, all of whom believed they were her exclusive romantic interest. The evidence boxes contained love letters from her various marks, financial statements showing money transfers totaling over $400,000, and detailed profiles of potential targets that read like intelligence briefing. Vanessa hadn't just destroyed my marriage, she'd been systematically destroying families across 3 states. The Portland police want to hold a press conference, Patricia informed me, gesturing toward a folder marked Media Strategy. This case is going to generate significant publicity, and they want to warn other potential victims about Vanessa's methods. The prospect of my personal humiliation becoming front-page news,
should have been terrifying, but instead I felt a sense of just. Other women deserved to know about Vanessa's predatory behavior before they suffered the same devastation I had experienced. My phone buzzed with a call from Caroline, who had been managing my interior design business while I dealt with the legal proceeding. Her voice was excited as she reported the day's developments. 3 new clients today, Caroline announced. Apparently word is getting around about your situation, and women are specifically requesting you because they think you'll understand what they're going through. The ironic twist was that Ryan and Vanessa's betrayal had actually enhanced my professional reputation. Women who were dealing with their own marital problems wanted to work with someone who had survived similar challenges and emerged stronger. The Morrison Hotel project wants to expand their contract, Caroline continued. They're so impressed with your work that they want you to design their entire chain of boutique properties. The business success felt like vindication of everything I'd built independently of my marriage to Ryan. While he had been stealing from his company and destroying his reputation, I had been creating something valuable and sustainable. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor at my home. Ryan stood on my front porch looking haggard and desperate, a stark contrast to the confident man who had been conducting an affair in my kitchen just months earlier. Natalie, he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, I need to talk to you. I studied his appearance through the security camera Margaret had installed after Vanessa's eviction. Ryan had lost weight, his hair was unkempt, and his clothes suggested he'd been sleeping in his car rather than the luxury apartment he and Vanessa had supposedly rented. What do you want, Ryan? I asked through the intercom system. Please, he said, looking directly into the camera with desperate eyes. Just 5 minutes. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you. Against my better judgment, and Patricia's specific instructions to avoid any contact with Ryan, I opened the door. The man standing before me bore little resemblance to the husband who had confidently announced his intention to leave me for another woman. You look terrible, I observed, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the tremor in his hand. I haven't slept in 3 days, Ryan admitted, following me into the living room I'd restored to my original design aesthetic. Ever since the indictments were announced, my life has been completely destroyed. The irony of him complaining about his life being destroyed was almost too perfect to acknowledge, but something in his appearance suggested genuine desperation, rather than his usual manipulative self-pity. Where's Vanessa? I asked, settling into my recovered armchair and gesturing for him to sit on the sofa. Ryan's laugh was bitter and hollow. Gone. Disappeared the moment she realized the FBI was investigating her operation. Turns out everything about her was a lie, including her name. The revelation that Vanessa Cole wasn't even her real identity shouldn't have surprised me, but it added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. Her real name is Victoria Sanderson, Ryan continued, his voice hollow with defeat. She's wanted in 3 other states for similar schemes. The FBI thinks she's been running this operation for over 5 years. The scope of Vanessa's criminal enterprise was staggering, but what struck me most was Ryan's complete shock at discovering her true nature. He had genuinely believed that their relationship was based on authentic emotion, rather than calculated manipulation. I lost everything for a woman who never existed, Ryan said, his voice breaking with the weight of his realization. My marriage, my business, my reputation, my freedom, all for someone who was using me, from the very beginning. The devastation in his voice was real, but it was impossible for me to feel sympathy for someone who had chosen to destroy our marriage for an illusion. What do you want from me, Ryan? I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the complex emotions his presence stirred up. I want to apologize, he said, looking directly at me for the first time since entering the house. I know it doesn't change anything, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand how badly I hurt you. The apology was more genuine than anything he'd said to me in years, but it also felt inadequate to address the magnitude of his betrayal. I also want to tell you that I'm planning to plead guilty to all charges, Ryan continued. My attorney thinks I might get a reduced sentence if I cooperate fully with the investigation into Vanessa's operation. The decision to plead guilty was clearly motivated more by legal strategy than genuine remorse, but it would spare me the ordeal of testifying in a criminal trial. Patricia will be pleased to hear that, I said. It simplifies the divorce proceedings considerably. Ryan nodded, his shoulders sagging with defeat. I signed the papers yesterday. You can have everything. The house, the accounts, the business asset. I don't have any right to fight you on anything. The complete capitulation was satisfying in theory, but seeing Ryan so thoroughly broken was less enjoyable than I'd expected. This wasn't the powerful revenge I'd fantasized about. It was just sad and pathetic. There's something else, Ryan said, reaching into his jacket pocket. I found this among Vanessa's things before she disappeared. I thought you should have it. He handed me a leather journal that I recognized as my own, one I'd thought I'd lost months early. Inside were pages of my personal thoughts and observations about our marriage, including passages where I'd wondered if Ryan was having an affair. She was studying you, Ryan explained, his voice filled with self-loathing, learning your routines, your insecurities, your weakness. She used this information to plan how to replace you in my life. The violation represented by Vanessa's theft of my private thoughts was almost more disturbing than her affair with my husband. She had literally studied me like a target in preparation for destroying my life. Why are you showing me this? I asked, closing the journal with trembling hands. Because you deserve to know the truth about what happened, Ryan replied, and because I need you to understand that none of this was your fault. You were targeted by a professional criminal who manipulated both of us. The explanation was clearly meant to provide some comfort, but it also served to minimize Ryan's responsibility for his choices. Even in his moment of apparent remorse, he was still looking for ways to share blame rather than accepting full accountability. Ryan, I said, standing up to signal that our conversation was ending, I appreciate the apology and the information, but I need you to leave now and not come back. He nodded with resignation, moving toward the door with the defeated posture of someone who had lost everything that mattered to him. For what it's worth, he said, pausing at the threshold, you were always too good for me. I hope you find someone who deserves you. The parting comment was clearly meant to be generous, but it felt more like another manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for destroying his life in response to his betrayal. After Ryan left, I called Margaret to report the encounter. Her response was immediate and concerned. He's trying to create sympathy and minimize the consequences of his actions, she warned. Don't let his apparent remorse influence your resolve to pursue full legal accountability. The advice was sound, but seeing Ryan's genuine desperation had complicated my feelings about the situation. Revenge felt less satisfying when the target was already completely destroyed. 3 weeks later, I sat in Judge Harrison's courtroom, as Ryan was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud. He stood at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. The prosecutor's presentation of evidence was thorough and damning, detailing not just the financial crimes, but the personal devastation Ryan's actions had caused to multiple families. Several other wives gave victim impact statements describing how Ryan and Vanessa's scheme had destroyed their marriages and financial security. When my turn came to address the court, I spoke about the psychological manipulation and emotional abuse I'd endured, the violation of trust that had shattered my sense of security and self-worth. But I also acknowledged that Ryan's punishment would not undo the damage he'd caused or restore what had been lost. Judge Harrison's sentence was harsh but fair, reflecting both the severity of Ryan's crimes and his cooperation with the ongoing investigation into Vanessa's network. 4 years would give him time to reflect on his choices, while ensuring that other potential victims were protected from his influence. Vanessa remained at large, having fled the country before federal agents could arrest her, but Interpol had issued international warrants, and Patricia was confident that she would eventually be captured and extradited to face justice. The civil lawsuit against both Ryan and Vanessa resulted in a judgment that awarded me complete ownership of our marital assets, plus substantial punitive damages. While I would likely never collect the full amount from Vanessa, the judgment provided legal closure and financial security for rebuilding my life. 6 months after Ryan's sentencing, I stood in the renovated office space I'd leased in downtown Portland, watching as Caroline directed the installation of new equipment and furniture for our expanded interior design firm. The business had grown exponentially as word spread about our specialization in helping women rebuild their lives after devastating betrayals. The Seattle clients want to schedule a consultation for next week, Caroline reported, reviewing our packed appointment calendar, and the documentary producers called again about filming a segment on your story. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, but I'd learned to use it strategically to raise awareness about predatory relationship fraud, and to promote services for other women in similar situations. Margaret appeared in the doorway carrying coffee and pastries from our favorite cafe, a ritual she'd maintained throughout the legal proceedings and business expansion. At 73, she had become more than a neighbor and legal advisor. She was the closest friend I'd ever had. The Portland Women's Legal Foundation wants to give you their advocacy award, Margaret announced, settling into one of the client chairs we'd arranged in my new office. Apparently your case has inspired dozens of other women to come forward with similar experience. The recognition felt surreal given how powerless and victimized I'd felt just a year earlier, but Margaret's guidance and Patricia's legal expertise had transformed me from a victim into an advocate for other women facing similar challenges. Doc Voss thinks we should consider writing a book, I told Margaret, reviewing the notes from my latest therapy session, something that combines the personal story with practical advice for other women. The idea of sharing my experience publicly still felt daunting, but the potential to help other women avoid or survive similar situations made the discomfort worthwhile. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Congratulations on your new business success. You've learned to fight back impressively. Hope we can meet again someday under better circumstances. The message from Vanessa, sent from what was obviously a burner phone, sent a chill through me despite the months that had passed since her disappearance. She was still out there, still targeting new victims, still confident in her ability to manipulate and destroy. I forwarded the message immediately to Patricia and the FBI agents handling Vanessa's case. The communication would provide new evidence for tracking her location and building the case against her criminal network. She's still playing games, Margaret observed, reading the message over my shoulder. Even facing international warrants, she can't resist trying to maintain psychological control. The text message was clearly designed to unnerve me and assert Vanessa's continuing presence in my life. But instead of fear, I felt a surge of determination to ensure that she faced justice for all the lives she'd destroyed. That evening, I sat in my restored living room, with a glass of wine and my father's latest medical report. His recovery from the heart attack had been slower than expected, but he was finally strong enough to travel. My parents were planning to visit Portland for the first time since his surgery. The quiet satisfaction of my reclaimed space felt like the most profound victory of all. Every piece of furniture, every artwork, every carefully chosen detail reflected my own taste and preferences, rather than someone else's vision of what my life should look like. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock, and I opened it to find Frank Delacroix, Margaret's friend who had been serving as an unofficial neighborhood security coordinator during the legal proceedings. His expression was serious but not alarmed. "Evening, Natalie," Frank said, removing his cap politely. "Thought you should know we've had some unusual activity on the street tonight. Car with out-of-state plates has been parked across from Margaret's house for the past 2 hours. The surveillance was likely connected to Vanessa's text message, either law enforcement tracking her communications, or possibly Vanessa herself conducting reconnaissance. Either way, Frank's vigilance provided an additional layer of security that had become necessary given the circumstance. "I'll call Patricia," I said, noting the license plate number Frank provided. "Thank you for keeping watch." The network of support that had developed around me during this ordeal felt like something I'd never experienced before. Margaret's protection, Patricia's legal advocacy, Caroline's business partnership, and now Frank's security assistance had created a community of allies I could depend on. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the transformation my life had undergone in less than a year. The devastated wife who had discovered her husband's affair had evolved into someone stronger, more resourceful, and more connected to her own power than ever before. Ryan was serving his prison sentence, learning firsthand about the consequences of his choices. Vanessa remained at large but was hunted by law enforcement agencies across multiple continents, and I had rebuilt my life into something better than what had been destroyed. The revenge I'd planned so carefully with Margaret and Patricia had succeeded beyond our wildest expectations. But the real victory wasn't their punishment, it was my own transformation, from victim to survivor to advocate. Standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the neighborhood where this entire ordeal had begun, I felt a profound sense of closure. The house was mine, the business was thriving, and most importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self-worth and personal power. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients to help, new opportunities to turn my painful experience into something that could benefit other women. But tonight I was simply grateful to be home, in my own space, surrounded by the life I had chosen to build rather than the one someone else had tried to impose on me. Vanessa had wanted to move me out of my own life and take my place. Instead, she had inadvertently given me the strength to build something far better than what I'd lost. In trying to destroy me, she had actually liberated me from a marriage and a life that had been holding me back from my true potential. The irony was perfect, and the justice was complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.